week that the Russians will only accept payment in rubles. So I'm assuming that he's not bluffing. Now, if he's not bluffing because that's his background, then I presume the gas will be switched off on the 31st of March, in which case we are in serious trouble. And I think that perhaps the extent to which we are in serious trouble is not understood.
Well, who's we? Who's we?
I mean the West, the Europeans first and foremost, but potentially, dare I say it, the United States, the whole world. Because, I before we did this program, I sent you an article from the Financial Times. Now, the Financial Times, I should say, is a militantly anti-Putin newspaper. It reproduces every fantastic story about the war. We were discussing an equally fantastic story about the progress of the negotiations. But at the same time, it has to provide a service to the business community. And business people do need, from time to time, accurate analysis about what's going on. And that's why from time to time, it's the Financial Times that provides us with accurate updates about the actual situation on the battlefront. And they've just now done that with the gas. And what they've shown is that all the talk about replacing Russian gas is simply utopian, at least as far as Europe is concerned. Europe consumes 500 billion cubic meters of gas every year. Some of it, much of it, it produces itself. But European natural gas production is falling. They've been increasing their imports of Russian natural gas. Russia exports around 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe every year. That's around 40% of the natural gas that Europe consumes. There is no substitute for it. This announcement, wasn't even a deal, this announcement that Biden and Ursula von der Leyen made last week about the US providing Europe with extra natural gas. It was only 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Now that's just a tenth of imports from Russia, and that apparently would be extremely difficult for the US to provide on present production. If you can't, what the US would have to do if it was to add that 15 billion to the 22 billion cubic meters of natural gas it provides to Europe in any one year, if it was to actually increase the amount by that figure, it would have to divert natural gas away from its Asian customers. And that's impossible to do without raising the price. But there's a further problem, which is that even if the United States cranked up production of natural gas in some way, even if it did divert all this production from Asia, leading to higher worldwide gas prices, there is still a lack of capacity in Europe, LNG terminals and all the rest to cope with this extra LNG gas from the United States. So it can't be provided anytime soon. Now, if Putin is serious and gas is cut off on the 31st of March, that means that as of the 31st of March, Europe is without 40% of its gas. Now, that might present problems for the Russians, but presumably they've planned for this and they seem to be in a mood where they can absorb it. What does Europe do? Now, I'm hearing all kinds of plans and projects about how we reduce gas consumption, we lower our thermostats, we reduce usages of gas. All this is wartime stuff, and it's very, very difficult to see how we can maintain a civilian economy across Europe if the Russians simply switch the taps off in that kind of way. So we just have to wait and see. Do the Russians need to sell the gas more, or do we need to buy it more? clearly, in Europe, we need to buy it. The only question is, do the Russians need to sell it? And I repeat again that Vladimir Putin is somebody who doesn't bluff.
Yeah. Robert Habeck, he's like a super minister. He's like the German minister of like economy, energy, and climate protection and all of these things. And I think he's also like vice chancellor. He's like a super minister. Anyway, he came out with a statement and he said that paying for the gas in rubles would be a breach of the contract that they have in place. My question to you is, did not the EU and the US, the collective West, Germany, did they not break the contracts that they have in place with the sanctions that prevented Russia from working with euros and dollars? Number one, that's the first question that I have for you. And is there a way for Germany, let's just take Germany in this case, to circumvent this decree, this policy from the Kremlin by somehow paying for the gas in euros and then having Gazprom Bank or Sberbank convert those euros or those USD into dollars and thus going into the coffers of the Kremlin?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen on the second, but on the first, let's be absolutely clear about this. I mean, for the EU to simply say, well, this is absolutely shocking, it's a breach of contract. Sanctions are a breach of contract. That is what they are. You announce sanctions, which are not commercial actions, they're political actions, by the way. But you announce sanctions, you seize money from the money of a central bank, which is a default, by the way. Always remember that. You cancel Nord Stream 2, which is a breach of contract as well. I mean, didn't even complete its certification process. You do any number of things like that. All of these are breaches of contract. It's fascinating to see how Europeans and Westerners suddenly discover the sanctity of contracts when it applies to them, but don't worry about the sanctity of contracts when it applies to others. I remember so well Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, when the United States was mumbling at that time about sanctioning a Russian gas pipeline, coming along and saying contracts are sacred. They are enforceable against you, just as you can enforce them on others. You do not interfere with contracts, claiming that what you're doing is sanctions, and then assume that this is somehow a legal way of evading your contractual obligations. So yes, the West has breached its contracts with Russia. It's defaulted on its obligations to Russia. And now, of course, the Russians are preparing to do the same to the West. And of course, the West doesn't like it, and they're complaining about contracts. But of course, it was they who initiated this. Now, what the Europeans do out in this situation, I simply don't know. Whether they can find some way round, I'm not absolutely sure. I don't really see how paying Gazprom back money in euros and having it Gazprom Bank then convert it all into rubles. I'm not quite sure how that works exactly and why that would comply with this Kremlin decree. I mean, it doesn't seem to me to make any sort of sense, actually. But of course, from their point of view, from the European point of view, their massive concern must be that, of course, if they do pay for this gas in rubles, then the most eye-catching part of the sanctions is suddenly being left completely meaningless. Because at that point, if they're paying for the gas in rubles, the ruble in effect becomes a hard currency. So the freezing of the central bank's reserves suddenly looks like it's become a lot less important. And of course, if the Russians are going to say, well, since you're paying us in rubles, we don't want you to use the SWIFT interbank payment system anymore. From now on, you'll be sending your payments through our interbank messaging system, the SPS or whatever it's called. Well, then, of course, as I said, the most important of the sanctions suddenly look meaningless. And of course, that's not what the Europeans want to do, which is why at the moment they're feverishly running around hoping that, in fact, what Putin is saying is simply a bluff. I don't think he's bluffing. As I said, I've never seen this man bluff. He's not bluffed over the last few months. I think this is absolutely for real. And as I said, on the 31st of March, we'll see what happens and what the Europeans do.
Yeah, like 4 weeks ago, say 3, 4 weeks ago, the Europeans were bragging about how they've sunk the ruble, and the ruble is like at 140, 150, and they were going
Which is
all over the
already
place, media
which is
channels.
which is already disappointing from their point of view, by the way. I think that they were
Yes,
expecting
yeah.
a far, far bigger collapse than happened. I mean, it never went into free fall as had been expected. But anyway, that's another
Well,
story.
well, yeah,
But yeah,
Biden did brag about it during his State of the Union as well. I think he said
absolutely.
40%, the ruble's devalued something like 40%, and everyone was clapping. Oh my God, this is incredible. We've sunk the Russian economy. I think today the ruble is at like 90, 89, 90, 91. So I mean that's completely collapsed. Now if they have to pay for the gas in rubles, I imagine that the ruble is just going to strengthen even more. I wouldn't be
Absolutely.
surprised if it goes back to 80. I really would not be surprised. Um,
I'm not going to guess, but I'm
yeah,
sure
you,
you're
you
right.
wanted to
Yeah.
say something?
No, I'm sure you're right. I mean, I
No,
don't want to guess
yeah.
where it will go,
I,
but
I can't
I'm sure
predict
you're
this,
right.
but
I can't
yeah.
predict this exactly, but I'm sure you're right, and I'm sure. And I also, by the way, what I'm hearing is that domestic inflation in Russia is actually now. It surged at the end of February, at the beginning of March, but now it's falling back because domestic production, especially of foodstuffs, is starting to kick in. So it's not worked out as expected. But if they have to pay in rubles, it's not just that the Russian economy won't crash. It's that, as I said, their sanctions are in effect cancelled. I mean, it would essentially cancel the biggest, most eye-catching part of the sanctions. And of course, if they don't pay in rubles and the Russians aren't bluffing and the gas is stopped, well, the West European economy is in very serious trouble, and that's going to affect the United States as well, where Biden's ratings are again plunging, where 71% of Americans say the country is going in the wrong direction, and where there is, I suspect, a growing lack of confidence or loss of confidence in the administration and its leadership. And by the way, I'm starting to see more and more criticisms of Biden starting to appear in the British media as well. I mean, there was a article in the Daily Telegraph, of which there is no more fervid an opponent of Russia and of Putin. The most grotesquely ludicrous stories about the war, about the Ukrainian victories, appear in the Daily Telegraph. But even the Daily Telegraph had to say that Biden's trip to Europe was a train wreck.
Oh yeah, it was it was a complete train wreck. And you don't see Biden or the Biden White House or Ursula von der Leyen in the EU talking about where the ruble is now, do you? They've shut up about it, completely shut up about it. Yes, and it's not only a problem of quantity. It's not only the fact that the U.S. or any country, they just can't fulfill the quantity that's needed for the European Union. There's the question of reliability. You're talking about LNG as opposed to just sending the gas via a stable, secure pipeline. Big difference there. Reliability, stability, predictability, which is something a business needs. A business needs to know that this cost is fixed, it's going to be reliable, it's not going to be variable, and it's going to be cheap, not only for a business, but for the consumer. Even even if the US can pick up some of the slack, Europe is going to have to tell their citizens and their businesses, yeah, okay, we'll make it by. Maybe we'll have some, we'll have to take cold showers, or your business will have to work Monday to Thursday and shut down on Friday. Whatever they come up with, um, it still is not going to change the price that they're going to have to pay on top of the cutbacks, which is going to be 10, 20 times more. So you have that issue. And finally, I want to ask you, Why? Why should Russia even think about accepting payment in any commodity in euros or USDs? Because number one, it's useless to them. What are they going to do with euros or USD? They've been cut off everywhere. For them, holding a dollar at this moment in time is like it's like holding, a piece of paper, an empty piece of paper, a blank sheet of paper. It's meaningless. And even going further than that, why should they accept any payment in reserve currencies, especially USD and euro, given the fact that the trust has been broken
Well, they
with the
did accept it.
collective West? It's like saying, you know what, we'll pay you in USD, but we'll probably confiscate that USD in about
I
2
know.
weeks' time anyway,
Well,
because they've already done it. So
well,
I don't see any upside for Russia to come to some sort of accommodation with
well,
Germany or the European Union or the US for that matter.
I happen to agree with you. I mean, if you go to Russia apparently today, it is an entirely ruble-based economy now. I mean, it's almost impossible to convert rubles into dollars and euros, which I suspect, by the way, is one major reason why the ruble has strengthened, because people in Russia have to use it. So why wouldn't the Russians insist that payment to them is in rubles, since it is the only currency, as you rightly say, or at least the major currency now that they can use? They can use, obviously, RMB, Chinese RMB, they can use rupees, but why shouldn't they use the ruble? I happen to agree with you. I think this makes complete sense. And of course, it's obviously again something that wasn't thought through. But, think about it. If the ruble strengthens, if it becomes, in effect, a globally tradable currency, which, to be very clear, if West Europe has to pay for natural gas in rubles, it would instantly become that. If it becomes a globally tradable currency, then everything changes. I mean, take the case, for example, of Russian debt repayments. The Russians say that they would pay in rubles. And up to now, that's been ridiculed, and people say, well, we're not prepared to accept payment in rubles. But, of course, if the ruble is now internationally convertible and a valuable currency to hold because it's become a globally traded currency like the USD, the euro, the pound sterling, the Japanese yen, well, perhaps people would want to accept rubles in return for their debt obligations. You can see the ramifications of this, and it's absolutely clear that the Western powers never thought it through, and they don't really know, I think, what to do. I mean, you mentioned Robert Habeck. I mean, one of the most depressing things is the extent to which Germany has an economics minister who is at the moment totally out of his depth. I mean, I still shudder at his trip to Qatar, where he went to Qatar and announced that he had a long-term deal with the Qataris to buy LNG, and the Qataris said no. I mean, this isn't true. I mean, they contradicted him. This had no reality to it. So we are dealing with European leaders at every level of the political system, both in Brussels and in national governments, who are disastrously out of touch with economic realities and who don't obviously understand how markets work, how businesses work, how industries work, what is necessary to keep supply chains moving, what is necessary to keep energy moving, why businesses need, as you correctly said, predictable energy costs. Clearly, they don't understand any of this, and they're now being found short. And as I said yesterday, we had a report from the Bank of England warning the British people, and of course it's going to be worse in Europe, that they're going to face an unprecedented squeeze on living standards this year. And all for what?
All for what? The country, once again, I always repeat this. Doesn't matter what side you're on in this conflict. If you're an EU citizen, if you're in a country that's in the European Union, you always have to ask yourself, why are we going to suffer for a country that is not in the European Union?
Well, indeed.
I mean, that is a very basic question, and I'm not trying to take away from what's going on in Ukraine or the suffering in Ukraine or the war. I'm speaking specifically on as people who live in the European Union who have to ask themselves, or will ask themselves, I imagine in 6 months, why is all of this happening for a country that is not a member state?
Well, indeed. Well, it
Why
was
are we
all,
doing this?
well, indeed. I mean,
And,
we
and,
had
and
an,
that comes to my final question to you. Why? Why is Germany doing this? Why is the EU doing this?
yeah, well, because they all got hitched onto this bandwagon, which was regime change in Moscow. I mean, this is what they were all up for. I mean, I'm sure there's been discussions about this for some time, actually, at various levels, but clearly that's been the plan all along, and they massively underestimated both the effects and the impossibilities, and they didn't really think through the Russian responses. But of
Yeah,
course, this was a
but
decision
why?
by the
Why go after
elites.
Russia?
Well,
Yeah. Why go
why do
after
you?
Russia like
Well,
this?
why did
I
Europe?
think that's, yeah.
Yeah, why did Europeans? I mean, we can understand why the US would. Why did the Europeans do it? Well, because the Europeans, I think it's fair to say, across Europe, we find this ideological grouping within the EU, which is also viscerally hatred, loathes Russia, loathes Putin, and got blinded by those ideas because, of course, they want to see Putin go because they think that they can then get unrestricted access to Russian natural resources. I mean, I suspect this is ultimately what it's all been about all along. And of course, what they realise now is, what the risk they now face is that they will be cut off from those resources entirely, which will leave them in a very, very difficult economic position. But, just to go back, just a few weeks ago, the Russians were asking for two things essentially: a commitment that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. Well, we've all but said that Ukraine is never going to join NATO. So what was difficult about confirming that? And Ukraine's fulfillment of the Minsk agreement, which in theory